December 9th, 2008. Clint Eastwood is mid-sentence with Entertainment Tonight. Cameras rolling. 500 reporters waiting. Then he stops talking. Just stops. The interviewer's confused. Clint's staring past her shoulder at something in the crowd. Without a word, he walks away from the camera. Security moves to stop him. He keeps walking, straight toward the metal barriers at the back, where nobody important stands. The crowd parts. And then, this 78-year-old man does something that makes the entire premiere go silent. He jumps the barrier, drops to one knee, and everything Hollywood thought mattered suddenly didn't. December 9th, 2008. Warner Brothers Studios lot in Burbank, California. This wasn't just another premiere. This was Gran Torino, Clint Eastwood's potential final performance as an actor. At 78, he'd hinted this might be it. No more tough guys. No more squinting into sunsets. Just directing from here on out. The industry showed up like it was a funeral and a coronation combined. Steven Spielberg was there, Morgan Freeman, every major studio head. Entertainment Tonight, Access Hollywood, E! News. 500 credentialed reporters lined that red carpet with one mission: get Clint to talk about his legacy. The film itself was already generating Oscar buzz, a story about Walt Kowalski, a Korean war vet who's angry at the world, racist, alone, drowning in his own bitterness. Then he meets his Hmong neighbors and finds something he thought he'd lost forever: purpose, redemption, a reason to matter before he dies. The critics who'd seen early screenings were calling it Clint's best work in years. Raw, honest, brutal in its examination of what war does to a man's soul long after the shooting stops. Warner Brothers had 2,000 people waiting inside that theater. They'd coordinated satellite feeds to 30 countries. The schedule was airtight. Red carpet interviews from 7 o'clock to 8 o'clock. Screening starts at 8:15 sharp. At 7:45, everything was running perfectly. Clint was working the carpet like a professional, giving thoughtful answers, posing for photos, playing the Hollywood game he'd been playing since 1955. Nobody knew that in 90 seconds, he was going to break every rule that premiere had, because 6 hours earlier, something had arrived that wasn't on anyone's schedule. James Patterson was 64, but his body had the mileage of someone pushing 90. Vietnam, 1971, 1st Battalion, 9th Marines. A landmine outside Da Nang took both legs below the knee. 3 surgeries just to keep him alive. 40 more years of phantom pain, nightmares that never stopped, and watching pieces of his life fall away one by one. His marriage ended in 1985. Couldn't hold down work. The VA checks covered medications, but not much else. By 2008, he was living in a shared facility in North Hollywood. 4 veterans in one room, thin walls, thinner hope. But James had one thing that kept him breathing: Clint Eastwood movies. Not the cowboy stuff, the war films, the stories about broken men who find a reason to keep going. Heartbreak Ridge, Letters from Iwo Jima, films that understood what it meant to survive something that should have killed you, then spend decades wondering why you're still here. When he heard about Gran Torino, he read everything. Every interview, every review. A Korean war vet named Walt Kowalski, who's drowning in rage and loneliness, who watches his neighborhood change and feels like a relic nobody wants anymore, who finds redemption by protecting people he initially hated. James saw himself in every description: the anger, the isolation, the feeling that he'd survived the war but died anyway. His daughter Lisa was a nurse, 38 years old, working 2 jobs, barely making rent. But she'd been watching her father fade for years, watching him sit in that shared room staring at walls. She saved for 3 months, every spare dollar, rented a wheelchair-accessible van for 1 day. They couldn't get premiere tickets. Those were invitation only, but maybe if they waited outside, her dad could see Clint just once, just for a moment. She had no idea what that moment would cost, or what it would give back. They arrived at 2 p.m. for an 8 p.m. premiere. The Warner Brothers lot was already crawling with security, setting up barriers, testing camera positions, running through protocols. A security guard saw the wheelchair and immediately shook his head. "Credentialed press only. You need to leave." Lisa's voice cracked when she explained. Her father, Vietnam, the legs, how Clint's movies were the only thing that made him feel seen, how they'd saved for months just to be near the premiere, not asking to go inside, just asking to stand where something important was happening. The guard looked at James. looked at the worn Marine Corps jacket, the way the old man's hands shook. "Back corner," he said quietly, "behind everyone else. Don't cause problems." They took their spot in the back row behind the barriers. James's wheelchair sat lower than everyone standing around him. He couldn't see the red carpet, couldn't see the entrance. Just the backs of photographers, the shoulders of entertainment reporters, the wall of people who belonged there. 4 hours passed. The sun set. Crowds grew thicker. James asked the same question every 15 minutes. "Is he here yet?" "Not yet, Dad." His back hurt. The December air was cold. Lisa tried holding up her phone to get a view over people's heads, but it was useless. Too many bodies, too much chaos. At 7:45, the crowd erupted, screaming, camera flashes like strobes. "He's here, Dad," Lisa said, her voice breaking. "Clint's here." James craned his neck, saw nothing but the backs of heads, heard everything, the shouting, the excitement, the sound of something important happening 50 feet away that he'd never be close enough to touch. One tear ran down his face. That's when Clint looked up. Clint was mid-answer with the Entertainment Tonight reporter. She'd asked about Walt Kowalski's character arc, about redemption, about what the film was trying to say about finding purpose when you think your life is over. He was giving a thoughtful response, talking about how the movie was really about confronting your demons before it's too late, about how sacrifice means nothing if nobody benefits from it. Professional, polished. The answer he'd given a dozen times already that night. Then, over the interviewer's shoulder, through a gap in the shifting crowd, he saw it. A wheelchair, way in the back, behind everyone. Behind the barriers where security pushes people who don't matter. A man wearing a military jacket. Not a costume, not a fashion statement. The real thing. Worn. Faded. The kind you keep because it's the only thing that remembers who you used to be. The man's face was turned away. His shoulders were shaking. Clint had played soldiers, had directed war films, had spent 50 years pretending to understand what combat does to a person. But he wasn't a veteran, never served, just an actor who'd made a career out of playing men tougher than he'd ever actually been. And there, 50 feet away, was someone who'd actually lived the story Clint was selling, crying, invisible, while 500 reporters fought to ask Clint about a character he'd invented. Something in Clint's chest tightened. Not the performance kind of feeling, the real kind. The kind that makes you forget where you are and what you're supposed to be doing. "Excuse me," he said to the interviewer. She was mid-question. Cameras were rolling. This was live television. He turned away, didn't wait for her response, didn't apologize, just walked, straight toward the barriers, toward the back, toward the man nobody else had noticed. The crowd went quiet, in spreading waves, confused whispers. Entertainment reporters exchanged looks. Steven Spielberg stopped his own interview to watch. Security guards moved to intercept. Clint's voice cut through. "Let me through, not a request." And then he reached the barrier where something was about to happen that Hollywood would remember longer than any movie. The people around James and Lisa suddenly realized who was approaching. Excitement erupted. Cameras swiveled. Reporters started running. But Clint's focus was locked on one person, the man in the wheelchair whose face was still turned away, whose daughter was staring at Clint like she was seeing a ghost. "Sir," Clint said. His voice carried that distinctive gravelly authority that had commanded 1,000 film sets. "You're a veteran, aren't you?" James Patterson slowly turned his head. His mouth opened. No sound came out. Clint Eastwood was standing 3 feet away, looking directly at him. "Vietnam?" Clint asked gently. James managed a nod. His throat had closed. 40 years of waiting to be seen, and suddenly, he was. Clint looked at the metal barrier between them, looked at the security guards, looked at the absurdity of a system that put barriers between him and a man who'd given legs for a country that forgot him. Then, at 78 years old, Clint Eastwood vaulted over that barrier. The crowd gasped. Cameras exploded in flashes. Warner Brothers executives started frantically talking into headsets. The Entertainment Tonight reporter stood frozen, microphone still raised, watching her exclusive walk away. Clint dropped to one knee beside James's wheelchair. Everything else, the premiere, the schedule, the 2,000 people waiting, the satellite feeds to 30 countries, ceased to exist. "What's your name?" Clint asked. James's voice came out as a whisper. "James? James Patterson, 1st Battalion, 9th Marines." "James?" Clint put his hand on the man's shoulder. Not the Hollywood hand, the real one, firm, steady. "Thank you for your service. Truly." James broke. Not quiet tears, full shaking sobs. 40 years of being invisible, of living in a shared room, of wondering if anyone remembered what he'd sacrificed. And Clint Eastwood was kneeling beside him in the middle of his own premiere. Lisa knelt too, tears streaming. "Mr. Eastwood," she managed, "you have no idea. Your movies kept him going. This one especially. Walt Kowalski. That's my dad. We just wanted to see you, just for a moment." "How long have you been waiting?" Clint interrupted. "Since 2 p.m. Clint's jaw tightened. He looked at James, looked at the wheelchair, looked back at the premiere entrance where Hollywood's elite were checking their watches. Then he asked a question that would delay a multi-million-dollar premiere by 40 minutes. "James," Clint said, "have you seen the movie yet?" James shook his head. "No, sir. We couldn't get tickets. We just wanted to be here, where it was happening." Clint was quiet. You could see him thinking, calculating. Then he turned to a security guard who'd followed him over. "Get David," Clint said. "Now." "Clint, the premiere's supposed to start in 10 minutes, the guard said nervously. "Then you better get David quickly." Not a suggestion, a command. The guard pulled out his radio. 2 minutes later, David Webb, the film's producer, was standing at the barrier looking stressed and completely bewildered. The red carpet interviews had stopped entirely. Every camera was pointed at Clint and the veteran in the wheelchair. "David," Clint said calmly, "we're delaying the start." "What?" "Clint, we can't. We have satellite feeds scheduled. 2,000 people waiting. We're delaying the start," Clint repeated, each word deliberate. "Because James here is going to watch this movie tonight. From the front row. And I'm going to sit next to him. Do we understand each other?" David had worked with Clint long enough to recognize when a battle was already lost. He nodded. "Also," Clint continued, "I need you to find out what VA facility James lives in, what his situation is, his medical care, his housing, everything. Can you do that?" David looked at Lisa, who was sobbing, at James, who looked like he couldn't breathe, at Clint, whose expression said this wasn't optional. "Yes," David said. "I can do that." "Good." Clint stood up, looked at James. "You ready to watch a movie?" James couldn't speak, just nodded. Warner Brothers executives were having meltdowns into their phones. The Entertainment Tonight producer was screaming at someone about losing their exclusive. Steven Spielberg was smiling. And Clint Eastwood grabbed the handles of James Patterson's wheelchair. What happened next would be replayed on news channels for weeks. But what happened after the cameras stopped rolling would change everything. Clint pushed the wheelchair himself. Not a studio assistant, not security. Him. Up the red carpet. Past the photographers who'd been screaming his name all night. Past the entertainment reporters who suddenly had a completely different story. Past Morgan Freeman, who quietly started clapping. Past Spielberg, who nodded with something like respect. Lisa walked beside her father, one hand on his shoulder, trying to understand how this was real. Warner Brothers staff were frantically rearranging the front row, moving studio executives, displacing VIPs. Nobody complained, not out loud. And not when Clint Eastwood was personally wheeling a Vietnam veteran past them. At the theater entrance, Clint stopped, turned to face the crowd of celebrities and press that had followed. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, that voice, that authority, "this is James Patterson, 1st Battalion, 9th Marines, Vietnam. He's seen things none of us have seen, sacrificed things none of us have sacrificed." The crowd went silent. "Tonight, he's watching this movie from the front row. Because if anyone deserves to see a story about a veteran finding peace, it's a veteran who's been searching for it for 40 years. The applause started slow, then built, then erupted. Hollywood's toughest, most jaded crowd was standing. Some were crying. These were people who'd seen everything, performed everything, faked everything, and they were moved. Clint pushed James into the theater, positioned the wheelchair in the front row center section, sat in the seat directly beside him. Lisa sat on James's other side, still unable to process what was happening. The theater was buzzing. Whispers, camera phones. This wasn't on anyone's script. "You ready?" Clint asked James quietly. James looked at him, at the screen, at his daughter, at a moment that shouldn't be possible. "I don't know what to say," he whispered. "Don't say anything," Clint replied. "Just watch." The lights dimmed, and for the next 2 hours, something happened that nobody expected, not even Clint. Clint watched his own movie that night, but mostly he watched James. Watched him flinch during the violence. The gunfire, the explosions. Not movie flinches, real ones, the kind that come from muscle memory. I'd watched him nod during Walt Kowalski's angry outbursts. The racism, the bitterness, the lashing out at a world that had moved on without asking permission. Watched him lean forward when Walt started protecting his Hmong neighbors, when the angry old vet found something to care about again, and watched him cry when Walt made his final choice, the sacrifice, the redemption, going out on his own terms, protecting people who mattered. When the credits rolled, the theater erupted. Standing ovation. James wasn't clapping. He was staring at the screen, processing. His face was wet. Clint turned to him. What did you think? James looked at Clint with red, exhausted eyes. That was me, he said. The anger, the loneliness, feeling like I survived the war but died anyway. He paused, struggled with words. But the ending gave me something. What's that? Hope. James's voice cracked. Hope that it's not too late, that I can still matter. Clint's hand went back to James's shoulder. You've always mattered. Some of us just needed a reminder to notice. The after-party was in full swing an hour later. Clint made a brief appearance, shook hands, accepted congratulations. Then he pulled David Webb into a quiet corner. I need you to do something, Clint said. Anything. Find out everything about James' situation. The VA facility, his medical care, his housing, all of it. David nodded, already pulling out his phone. And David, Clint continued, I want you to quietly establish a fund. Cover whatever gaps exist. Don't make it public. Don't make it a story. Just make sure he has what he needs. How much are we talking? Whatever it takes, Clint said. And find out how many other James Pattersons are out there who nobody's noticing. But this was only the beginning of what Clint actually did. Over the next 3 months, Clint worked with VA organizations, identifying veterans falling through the cracks, housing insecurity, inadequate medical care, social isolation, the invisible ones. He quietly funded a program, Assistance and Connection for Veterans in Los Angeles. James Patterson was first, not the last. Clint arranged for James to move from that shared facility to a small apartment. Proper accessibility, dignity. He covered medical treatments the VA benefits didn't touch. Got James a part-time consulting job on a veterans documentary Clint was producing. But more than money, Clint visited. No cameras, no press releases. Just 2 men talking about sacrifice and survival and what it means to find purpose after trauma. James lived 7 more years, reconnected with his estranged son, became a volunteer at a veteran center, told everyone about the night Clint Eastwood reminded him he still mattered. When James died in 2015, Clint attended the funeral. His eulogy was short. James taught me movies only matter if they connect to real lives. Walt Kowalski found redemption in a script. James found it in the years after we met. One story matters more. The program Clint established has helped over 3,000 veterans, funded through Gran Torino residuals, the unofficial motto among staff. Nobody waits in the back anymore. In 2016, Warner Brothers installed a small plaque where the red carpet sets up, in memory of James Patterson, USMC, and all veterans who reminded us to look beyond the barriers. December 9th, 2008. Gran Torino made $270 million worldwide. Critics called it Clint's masterpiece. But here's what they don't tell you about that night. What Clint actually saw in that wheelchair that made him jump a barrier and stop everything. Because it wasn't just about one forgotten veteran